A teenage boy overcomes the odds to become or achieve blank. A seemingly simple synopsis that acts as the golden formula for none other than Shounen Jump. Who doesn't love a good old shonen? For me at least, they're the equivalent of comfort food, something you can rely on for a good slice of entertainment, and maybe a bit of nostalgia on the side. Naruto, Bleach, One Piece, Fairy Tail, Black Clover, My Hero Academia, some of the biggest shonen of the last 20 years, and all great in their own right. I mean, you don't get to some of these episode counts by accident. But one common aspect between all these shows is that most of them follow a somewhat formulaic protagonist. It's always this angsty teenage boy with the world against him, literally sometimes. But this makes complete sense. What is the demographic for these shows? Teenagers, and that's no coincidence. Shonen protagonists are supposed to be relatable and maybe even a source of inspiration to the audience, who are likewise mostly teenagers. Naturally, you can appreciate a character much more if you personally share a common similarity with said character, even if it's subconsciously. This is definitely an overlooked part of building a character in my opinion, and is what shonen does so well. I mean, could you imagine if there was a shonen where the protagonist was like, I don't know, this 27-year-old alcoholic getting broke at the casino or something like that? That would just never work. I mean, shonen protagonists don't act like that. How is that even remotely relatable for a teenage audience? I mean, honestly, how could a character like that ever work out? Wait. Okay, so it's no secret I love Gintama. I'm sure from videos gone by, a lot of people watching this already know that, and one of the main reasons why I love it so much is none other than its protagonist. Right at the centre of it all, Sakata Gintoki. So let's get straight into it. As I was just joking about, Gintoki is definitely what you call an unorthodox protagonist, to put it lightly, deviating away from the traditional Shonen Jump ideas. About a decade of being a teenager, nothing in particular he needs to overcome, and sure he does have ambition, but he never has a definitive end goal he's working towards, like for example Naruto and becoming Hokage, or countless other examples. But ironically, that's what makes him work so well. His grounded nature is what makes him so easy to connect with. More so than most, he is believable. A funny contrast for a show that's so outrageously unbelievable. Simply put, he feels the most human. No larger than life ambitions, nothing all too special about him. He's just an average guy trying to live his life to the fullest. Something we can all relate to. I feel like a lot of shonen protagonists suffer from the same problem, where their motivation dominates their character a little too much. For example, take Tanjiro from Demon Slayer, a fantastic protagonist, don't get me wrong, but he did feel a tad one-dimensional. His only character traits, it seemed, were his affection for his sister and his redemption for the death of his family at the hands of evil Michael Jackson. But apart from that, there's nothing really that sets him apart. His character is only defined by traditional model shonen values. Determination, ambition, courage, compassion, you get the idea. But then you have Gintoki, at first glance a completely normal guy. Far from perfect, and that's the point. His imperfections make him all the more believable. He's a lazy drunk broke at the casino. He doesn't have any definitive ambition, which is odd considering a lot of the characters around him do. Shinpachi, for example, is a perfect fit for a shonen protagonist. Teenage boy, strong sense of justice, one clear ambition in life. Considering Gintama is a big old parody of the shonen genre, this definitely isn't a coincidence. But then you have Gintoki, all by himself, living the life he's chosen to lead one day at a time. Unlike a lot of other shonen protagonists, he doesn't have the privilege of being considered special or unique within the story. He's just another guy living in a world he loves that doesn't love him back, an outcast of mainstream society struggling to adapt to the world around him, and not to mention his internal struggles. Gintoki is a character you absolutely cannot judge on a surface level. Behind him being the centre of comedy Gintama is known for, his character goes much, much deeper. You just need to dig a little further to get there. As I said earlier, shonen anime are pretty formulaic. Let me go back to my two previous examples, Naruto and Demon Slayer, old and new, and take a look back at my opening. This conclusion can be drawn from literally the first episode. We know their goals straight away and generally what they need to overcome to achieve them, which makes complete sense. It's a great way of setting up the plot as soon as possible. But when you have a show like Gintama that doesn't really have plot outside of the major arcs, setting up Gintoki's character straight away isn't as necessary. If it's all episodic comedy, do we really need to know his backstory or ambitions as soon as possible? No, of course not. And this is something quite interesting about how his character is presented. Let's call it inverse character development. Whereas with traditional character development, we grow alongside the character as they, well, develop both mentally and physically over the course of the show, in Gintama, this is seen a lot less. Gintoki in episode 1 is fundamentally the exact same man as in episode 300. So what I mean by inverse character development is that instead of learning how he'll become in the future, we instead learn how he became his present self. We don't get to see really any major info on his childhood, upbringing, time in the war, etc. for a good couple hundred episodes, going back to my analogy from earlier that you really do need to dig a little further to understand his character. And this is what I like most. Gintoki is unusually mysterious for a shonen protagonist, nothing spelled out straight away. It's only for those who stick around for the long run who will learn how he became the man he is today, making it all the more satisfying. This makes him especially complex, despite his comedic outwards persona on the surface. For a long time, the audience is completely left in the dark. They don't know the pain and suffering he holds in his shoulders to get to where he is now until his backstory is gradually spelled out. It's quite sad when you take a step back, going back to his loneliness, living in a world rejected by society, left only with his turbulent past. I mean, not even the audience knows the pain he's feeling, let alone the rest of the cast. It makes these revelations about his past dotted throughout the series feel all the more powerful. He's been bearing these burdens all this time, trying to forget the past, only for it to be brought back up again. All of this adds up over time, and it's this gradual development of his character spread over hundreds of episodes, as opposed to literally the first episode, that makes him feel a lot more natural and, as I said earlier, believable. If Gintama was formatted like a traditional shonen, we would have probably seen much more linear chronological development of his character, starting from his childhood and transitioning into adulthood. But of course we don't, and I like that. It gives Hideaki Sorachi much more creative liberty in his writing. Instead of having to base the whole story on the first couple of chapters, when he was most likely a less experienced author, he could instead bring up fresh new ideas relating to Gintoki whenever he wanted to and weave them into the story, because he hadn't already established Gintoki's backstory earlier, which works well in the case of Gintama. It's certainly a unique way to develop a character, going essentially backwards instead of forwards, and I think this only works well for certain manga and anime. More often than not, more linear character development is the more reliable option. Like, for example, the big two seinen manga I've read, Berserk and Vinland Saga, have fantastic character development, and especially in Vinland Saga, it's pretty simple, childhood to adulthood. But anyway, I digress. Basically, if you haven't already noticed, I'm a big fan of how Gintoki is developed. It's handled incredibly well, and with that, I don't know what more I can add on that point, it's just good. And speaking of good, let's get on to his background. A child of war surrounded by corpses, drawn in by the light of Yoshida Shoyo to start his new life at Shokusonjuku School. After its demise, he would then fight in the Jōai War, fighting back against Amanto colonization of Edo, earning him a reputation as Shiroyasha, landing him as either a war hero or a war criminal, depending on the perspective. And that leads on to the guy we see in episode 1, Sakata Gintoki as he stands now, a stark contrast to the life he used to lead, which makes all of the more grounded, serious parts of Gintama become even more impactful. Each time we see Gintoki flip the switch back to his killer instinct, we get a glimpse into the past, the kind of person he was on the battlefield, reawoken once again. And the fact that Gintoki is usually the source of comic relief makes these moments all the more shocking. More often than not, Gintama fights have strong emotional weight behind them. Let's take Gintoki vs Jirocho. That fight was spawned out of pure, unadulterated rage, and it's at these points where we see Gintoki break away from his usual persona, and instead release all of the anger locked up inside him, all of this hatred manifested during the war being brought back once again, a completely different beast to what we've come to expect of him. As I've mentioned in previous videos, Gintama's great when it comes to contrasting ideas. When you have a show that 9 times out of 10 doesn't take itself seriously at all, having that one time where it does indeed do a complete 180 comes as a shock, and this is true with Gintoki himself. He's portrayed most of the time as an absolute clown, but This serves to make the times he actually does get serious all the more powerful, since you don't expect it, and therefore it becomes more distinctive. Let me put it to you this way. You wouldn't expect a serious character, for example like Yagami from Death Note, to suddenly just start cracking jokes left, right and centre and turn Death Note into a comedy. So to some degree, surely the same applies vice versa. You wouldn't expect a guy like Gintoki to suddenly flip the switch and show his maturity, pushing Gintama out of being a comedy. Basically, it's this shocking change in tone Gintama is so great at doing, which serves to highlight the dark side of Gintoki that much more, making him feel even more alive. Gintoki is a good example of what's called present time orientation, basically the idea of caring solely about the present. Not the future, not the past, whatever happening right now is what's most important. He lives in the moment, acting purely on instinct and his own individual beliefs, and this makes complete sense. Of course he doesn't want to cling onto his turbulent past, but likewise not cling onto hope when looking into the future. Gintoki knows full well just how brutal life can be, and with that the dangers of hopefulness. Just as his life was back on the right tracks, it imploded back on itself. Unlike most shonen protagonists, Gintoki is mature, sometimes, and above all else, experienced. He's already been to hell and back, and he knows how to handle a situation and what values he needs to deal with society. But while he may indeed have the physical and mental capacity of an adult, his habits and personality still remain that of a child. You know, picking his nose, a chronic sweet tooth, a lack of financial responsibility, those kind of things. This is an incredibly interesting aspect of his character, the great dilemma. On one hand, he shows the typical adult maturity you'd expect, and on the other, he shows the behaviour of a child. Certainly not what you'd expect considering all he's been through. This leads me to believe that because of his non-stop involvement in war, he's never had the chance to develop as a person. I mean, when would he have picked up the skills needed for adulthood, where most of his life was surrounded by corpses? His only light of hope was those few years spent at Shokusonjuku, his one chance to develop as a person, before all of that hope was obliterated, with him instead being forced back onto the battlefield during his teenage years. He holds on to these childish tendencies because that's all he's ever known. Unlike most people, he was never given the opportunity to grow up. His mid to late teens would have consisted of no education or parenting, only his comrades in the same position he was. And after the war, he's completely displaced. This is his first exposure to mainstream society. He doesn't know how to fit in, he knows nothing other than how to survive. And that's why during a fight, that's when he's at his most mature. It makes a lot of sense. The lesson of survival was literally the only skill he would have been able to develop during his years shaped by war and conflict. As I said at the beginning, he lives in a world he loves but doesn't love him back. Sakata Gintoki may look like a simple character at a surface level, but dig a little deeper and you'll see just how complex he is. And with that, that concludes my look into the internal factors that contribute to Gintoki's character in Gintama. Did I look at it too far? Probably, but if anything, I hope this was at least somewhat interesting. So now that I've covered all of the internal factors that make Gintoki so great in my opinion, let's get on to a couple of the external factors that I love. You know, stuff unassociated with the core narrative. For example, his character design, which is simple but effective. The white and blue on his robe contrasting against the black and red on his shirt makes him instantly recognisable and simply just works well together in my opinion. By anime standards, he looks pretty normal, a perfect reflection of his somewhat normal, quiet life after the war, settling down, opening a business and trying to blend in with the rest of society. His design strikes a good balance between simplicity and completely ridiculous, which of course has its place. I mean, JoJo's character designs are fantastic for a reason, but I like that Gintoki doesn't appear too over-designed. As I said, simple but effective, good use of colour, instantly recognisable. I don't know what more to say, it ticks all of the boxes. And with that, let me finish off with an anime-only factor, being Gintoki's voice acting. Tomokazu Sugita, the man behind Sakata Gintoki, has one of the most distinct voices in anime. This man has the deepest voice in the industry. No matter what anime he's in, even if he's a side character, he's instantly recognizable, especially when most shonen protagonists sound pretty similar since they're mostly teenage boys. Also, more as a testament for Gintama's voice acting in general, but these voice actors not only need to be talented, but incredibly diverse for a show like Gintama, which goes back and forth between comedy and intense action. And especially with how many weird situations Gintoki finds himself in, the fact that Sugita is able to adapt himself into the ridiculous but also serious scenes that happen in Gintama, it's nothing but commendable. But with that being said, I think I should wrap this up about now. I've rambled on for long enough, and if you'd like to suggest a future video idea, then by all means, comment it down below. And with that being said, I'll be back in the next one. See ya!